Hello, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural video of the Political Reformation. I am your host, Drew, and joining me today is my resident Republican named Harry. I personally have no political affiliation, but depending on the issue, I can swing one way or the other. Just kind of depends. Harry, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi,
List
I
your
guess today I'm
crimes.
being I guess today I'm being identified as a Republican. I kind of That's weird, but
If we
okay.
if we have anybody else coming over to us from the Atheist Reformation, they already know. They know this about you.
Okay.
You've already been outed.
I'm here to kind of co-host and assist for the special video today. Which, funny enough, that you mentioned the word inaugural.
Hey, it works out. It was tongue in cheek, and actually, well, more just clever, I suppose. But yes, today we are doing a presidential tier list video. We're going to rate the overwhelming majority of executives that this country has had since its inception, going all the way back to the OG George Washington. There will be a few that we will skip along the way for various reasons. Either nothing was really done while they were in office, and, nothing was done while they were in office, and they were in office for a very short period of time. Namely, people like William Henry Harrison, who died in office a month into his term. Um, but we'll get to those and see as well. The other criteria is we will not be judging any super duper current presidents on this, or ranking, not necessarily judging. So Joe Biden, who is the current sitting president, and Donald Trump will not be rated, and neither will Barack Obama. We will explain more of our rationale as we get closer to those. Although Trump and Biden we can explain right now. Biden is currently in office, so we can't really measure what his policies will or won't do to the country until several years down the road. And Donald Trump, as much as anyone hates to say this, we don't know if his political career as a president is over. He's only served one term, and by all technicality, by all constitutionality, he still has the option to try and run for president and pull a Grover Cleveland and serve a second term that is just non consecutive. So, that being said, I think we should go ahead and dive on in. What do you think, Harry?
Sounds pretty good. Should we talk a little bit about why we're not going to go over Obama, or leave that to later?
Oh, no, let's go ahead and talk about Obama. That actually slipped my mind. I would have been reminded as we got further on down the list, but hey, let's go ahead and do it now. Rationale for not discussing Obama is because he just left office in 2017, and that means he's only been out of office for 5 years. My personal rationale on it is I don't feel it is safe to judge the impact of a president's policies, whether they be executive orders, bills they sign into law, etc., until at least a decade after they have left office. And that's for several reasons that we'll get into as we discover, because there are certain laws that are on the books today that we didn't discover certain things about them until well on in years after that president left office, and in some cases, we didn't find out information um, about some of the things that took place during their presidencies until after they had died, and after they've been in office for multiple decades. So I think with that being the case, it's really even a stretch to judge George W. Bush in this one. But we're going to go ahead and do it anyway because he's been out of office for over 10 years, and we'll see how it goes. What are your thoughts on that, Harry?
I mean, if we don't include George Bush somewhere, we're going to have to basically draw the line at any president that is still alive we can't discuss. So,
I don't. Well, I don't know about that one because like Bill Clinton's still alive, Jimmy Carter is still alive.
but it'd be pretty arbitrary to discuss George Bush and to not discuss George Bush and then to discuss Clinton, you know?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I agree with you on that one. So yeah, I think that should about cover everything. If there's another one that we're going to skip because I thought of another reason to skip them, we'll get to it when we come across them in the list. How does that sound? Okay, so I'm going to
I'm
I've
just
got
giving the two thumbs up for our audience, who apparently is also like, yeah, you can skip them. We're cool with it.
I figured. So I've got my little cheat sheet, which is actually a Google Doc, on my iPad over here to my right. So if you see me glancing over and looking, that's just me pulling up notes that I have because I actually took. I'm not going to say extensive notes on every president, but out of 44 presidents, and I know for sure I skipped at least four. I've still got 14 pages of notes here. Did your Osmo do a thing again?
No, I'm trying to make it full screen because right now I'm just looking at the logo.
Oh. All right, so let's go ahead and transition screens here. Okay, so we are looking at a tier list right now. I'm going to explain the rationale here. We've got, let's see, I'm going to see if it'll let me share my screen with you real quick.
If you are able to share screen, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, I'm going to do that.
That is amazing.
You are able to see the screen share?
I see a big black screen.
That's not what's supposed to be there. It
Oh.
should be showing, you know.
I mean, it definitely took control of the window, so it's sharing something.
It's sharing something. Okay. Let's see if it'll just share the monitor itself.
It's just an abyss staring back at me.
Well,
I can see stuff.
you can see stuff now.
Yeah, like a pastel rainbow.
Okay, that's good. No, well, that's what you should be seeing right now. Okay, so looking at everything here, we've got rankings S, A, B, C, D, and F. So we've got standard, grade school rankings here, and then S tier for just those truly amazing presidents, which there should be very few up here. I'm kind of anticipating as we go through this, we get like maybe a half decent little bell curve going.
I do want it known that Drew rejected my proposition to use the Konami grading system that's popular in video games like Devil May Cry. He just said that was
I
too much.
I think that would be a bit too confusing, and also like the DMC ratings, they go from D all the way up to quadruple S.
Yes,
So it's like D, C, B, A, and then S, double S, triple S, quad S. That's 8 different rankings right there. I think that's completely asinine at that point.
fair enough.
I mean, maybe we do that for systems of governance. I don't know. Uh, I think we should actually do a tier list of different types of governments. I think that's more your speed, anyways, because of your you majored in political science, so I think that would actually really kind of feed into what you're good at there. And apologies advance to anybody watching this. You will see scrolling up and down. I just wanted a nice big full screen of the tier list itself, and then we'll see as time goes on. So our first president on the block here is going to be, oh, our buddy GW here. So I've got several listings for positives and negatives for George W. Bush. For anybody who is not aware or was too young during his presidency to know much about George W. Bush, George W. Bush was president from 2001 to 2009. He served 2 terms, and he was a Republican. Um, and his vice president both times was Dick Cheney. I don't know the VPs for all these presidents, so yeah, you're just going to have to live with that. If you want to know more about each president beyond what we talk about here, Google is your friend. And, that's what I hope this video does. That's what we hope this video does, is it encourages people to go through and take a look at these things and judge them for themselves and see what they think about these leaders that we've had both past and not so distant past, and what your thoughts are on them.
In the case of George Bush, if you'd like more information about him, then not only Google, but also WikiLeaks is your friend.
Yeah. That's definitely your friend. So let's not dwell on negatives, at least not immediately. Let's go ahead and give props where props are due, so to speak. And I think that's going to be the running theme is for every single president that we talk about here, we're going to start with the positives and then go to the negatives and see how we feel those weigh against each other. It's not just going to be a point for point analysis where, oh, if they have more negatives than positives, well, then that must mean they were a terrible president. I don't think that's the case. I think each individual option or each individual point should be graded on its own to a degree. But
Yeah, it can be a weighted value for
exactly,
each
a
one.
weighted value, a weighted scoring rubric, as it were, in school. So looking at his positives, a lot of people are probably going to talk smack about this one, but I honestly think that Bush handled the 9/11 attacks as best as he possibly could. I don't think at that time that there would have been a better leader to handle that situation. And this is coming from me who does not like George W. Bush as a president. I don't think I like the other option in 2000 that would have been in office at the time this happened would have been Al Gore. I'm not sure that stuff would have happened as quickly under Gore. I'm not sure the outpouring of public assistance that happened right when it happened. I'm not entirely sure that would have happened with Gore, but with Bush it did. Now, you can say what you want about the congressional actions and stuff like that later on down the road, and how uh, they weren't they drug their feet on compensation for 9/11 victims and things like that, and Jon Stewart's actions, which were phenomenal and all that. But that's not part of Bush's presidency. Those are congressional actions entirely outside of what he did as president, and so that's what we are grading here. What are your
I
thoughts on
mean,
that, Harry?
I think that pretty much any time that there's a wartime president and they are able to effectively communicate patriotism, they're seen in a positive light, whether or not that's fair to associate that as being positive or not. But I don't think that very many people who were politically conscious and aware during uh, during 9/11 really felt that he was, betraying America's position, or felt that he wasn't being strong enough or wasn't being firm enough with his wording, and the the actual actions that took place, I have a lot of disagreement with.
Okay.
But the way he presented himself and spoke about it, for the most part, aside from reenacting Top Gun and Mission Accomplished, that was a pretty hilarious faux pas.
Yeah, that was. Well,
Aside from little
now
goof
when
ups,
I say I'm not talking about how he handled Afghanistan or Iraq. I'm talking purely about how he handled the terrorist attacks as they happened, and
yes,
just his. I'm talking about the initial response. I'm being super specific on this point. I am only talking about the 9/11 attacks themselves and his immediate public response to it. Now, the mission accomplished stuff that comes later on. I do agree that those aspects are net negatives. I don't think Iraq was handled well. I don't think Afghanistan was handled well. If it had been, we probably wouldn't have still been there until his successor left office. And then his successor's successors completed the completed the removal of troops out of Afghanistan. I do, yeah. So that's where I feel it's safe to judge it as a
completed.
negative. Yeah, completed. But anyways, we're not discussing those two today because we're not.
Kind of like when I completed that loaf of moldy bread by throwing it to the ducks.
As long as they got some use out of it, I guess. But the ducks
Fair
didn't.
enough.
But the ducks didn't come back and try to kill you with them.
That we know of. But
Yeah,
yeah,
we
if
know
we're
of.
just talking about the
Anyways,
messaging in the first 3, 4 months, I mean, everyone in America had a flappy flag hanging out their window on
Oh,
their
sure,
car.
sure. Nothing,
So I mean,
nothing.
like we were, it wasn't really a divided time in America for those first 4 or 5 months, and that's effective. Whatever you're going to attribute that to, whether it's messaging or a strong leader or
Yeah,
whatever.
well,
That
and it's the fact that it was a complete turnaround from him as far as public approval, because he was already seen as a weak president, and in some cases not a legitimate president due to the the issues governing, the Florida vote count and everything in the
yeah,
2000 election. He was already viewed as a weak leader. He was already viewed as an illegitimate president by a decent enough chunk of the country. And then this happens and it's a complete turnaround. And I think part of what I believe makes him, or maybe not makes him, or that makes his handling of it very effective, is just because it was patriotism without bleeding too far into nationalism. And
yeah.
that's what I would have worried about at that time. Anyways, we're dwelling too much on a singular point. Let's go ahead and move on through. Um, he expanded Medicare in ways that actually benefited Medicare recipients. That was one of the few things he actually had at least some bipartisan support on. He did successfully increase funding for both the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. Those are two things that I think are actually important to the country. They do good things for the country. He did actually start and expand environmental protective policies that were actually substantive, which also include an investment in research towards alternative fuel resources. Now, I don't think any of that investment went towards nuclear, which I would have liked to see, but it did go towards renewables, which were still very new to us at that point as even being considered as a viable alternative energy source. And then the last thing is that he as a president, at least initially, now this did change later on down the road, he did try to make some useful steps towards immigration reform, such as paths to citizenship and decreasing deportations and stuff like that. And this was actually in direct opposition to his own party at the time.
Yeah, I would say pretty much everything you've listed up until that point, I would think is a negative. But on this one, I'll agree. And
Okay.
a lot of that has to do with him having the experience of being governor of Texas. Like, just conservatives in Texas like have a different viewpoint on the realities of immigration and are willing to come to some compromises and think of like legal pathways forward and things like that. That a lot of times conservatives in other parts of the country like they just don't know what they're talking about when they're like, "Boo, immigration bad." Like
Right. Yeah, the doom and gloomers are the ones that essentially tend to tune out. I mean, like I understand that they're there and that their absolutely terrible talking points need to be addressed and need to be dismantled publicly if at all possible. Uh, but for the most part, yeah, when you get into some parts, a lot of the parts of Texas, especially once you get down past in Texas, I want to say once you get down past about Corsicana,
yeah,
um, uh, start getting out of northeast and north central Texas, you start seeing a lot greater understanding towards the problems that we have with undocumented immigration. But they're problems in as much as
there's
how
systemic issues within the programs we have existing. They're not
exactly.
necessarily all the immigrants are the
Right.
ones that want
Yes.
them.
Our immigration systems are wildly outdated. They
Yeah,
are poorly managed. They are criminally underfunded, and there's no there's no real way for a person to effectively immigrate from another country to the United States without a massive amount of capital that they already have, which when you look at some of the situations in the nation of Mexico are is not that way.
I don't think I would agree completely with that statement, but what I
Maybe
will
not
say is that
completely.
for
It's definitely a bit of a generalization, and that's really because of what we're dealing with in terms of the show itself.
yeah, but for people who are trying to follow the process, there are way too many gotcha moments.
Yes, there are way too many. Well, if you miss this one tiny little thing, you have to start the process all over. That is ridiculous. That is draconian to me. And all that does is create problems.
Yeah, you're writing a process for normal everyday people that is written with technicalities that only 40-year experienced politicians would even understand. And
Or
it's
or 20
pretty
year
much unfair for the
or
most
or
part.
20-year attorneys.
Yeah.
Anyways, let's get to the negatives, and you'll see why I think you know, why I think that those were positives balance out against these negatives here. Um, Overall, poor overall economic policy. He was trying to revive Reagan's voodoo economics that didn't actually work. And yeah. Um but we'll talk more about Reagan when we get to old Ronnie. So, I think that under his direction his appointees poorly handled the 2008 financial crisis and the housing market burst, because there were warnings. There were plenty of warning signs. There were people who tried to call attention to it and were ignored by Bush appointees uh, in the finance sector. Like, there were people that just largely ignored them.
I mean, so much of this is like I feel like I understand the points, but I just take a different position on a lot of the points you're presenting.
That's fine. I get it. Um,
Like,
now, granted, like I do believe that the banks that failed should have been allowed to fail. I do not think we should have. I do not agree with the bailout. Like
yes,
like that's part of what I consider poor handling of the '08 financial crisis, is the fact that the bailouts even occurred.
but the bailouts more occurred in 2009.
They did, but they started under the Bush administration direction. Yes, they were completed under Obama, but the process had already started, and that's what they were already pushing for under the Bush administration before the '08 election even happened.
Because in 2008 process they were focused more on keeping families from getting evicted when it wasn't their fault because the bank itself was going to go under, and then in 2009 and later it focused more on the company itself getting a bailout so that because they were too big to fail.
Okay, but still, that ha- that still occurred under a Bush appointee as the head of the Fed.
Yes,
And
but
so that's more what I'm talking about, is these are the long-lasting effects of something that happened under George W. Bush. While the bailouts may have occurred after Bush left office, that is a long-term effect of his presidency. It was a Bush appointee at the Fed that ended up pushing for this. And yes, okay, Obama agreed to it and all that stuff. That's fine. That's on him. But we're not grading Obama. We're just grading the effects and the outcomes of the Bush presidency here.
yeah,
And I think that is a pretty big net negative to me. Also, people are. I'm probably going to get some flack for this one. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2002. I think that was one of the worst possible education bills we ever could have passed.
I agree, it was pretty bad.
I mean, it focused almost entirely on quantitative outcomes, which are completely counterproductive because they don't actually reflect real learning or academic ability.
Yeah, it was
It basically fetishized standardized testing.
yeah, put standardized testing into the classrooms and then kick teachers out.
Exactly. Or the teachers are only there to regurgitate what's put on the standardized test.
Yeah.
It removed the ability of teachers to teach. You could set a robot in there to just regurgitate what's on the test to the kids, and they'd probably do just as good.
and also the extra quote unquote credentials and training that teachers needed in order to be certified. And it's like
It
all you're
basically
doing is
nullifies
taking,
all those because you're just teaching to a curriculum handed to you by the state board of
well,
education.
that's what the certifications were there to do,
Yeah.
is essentially make actual classroom training no longer the prerogative. And
All right.
so the only people that would have it would be the new people that just got out of college that had to do all of it as part of their 4-year degree on how to be a teacher.
True.
And then all your experienced teachers are going to be kicked to the curb unless they managed to do it in the course of 9 months while they were, also currently teaching and having a job.
Right. Right. All right. So anyway, moving along. Poor handling of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. That was mismanagement. That was poor handling.
Yeah,
He quite literally left on a fishing trip in the middle of a crisis.
I
That is
don't think
extreme, regardless of whether or not you think that he could have done anything personally at that point. That's not the point. It is the optics. It is the message that he sends as president as to how seriously he is taking a part of his country under crisis. That
I
is
don't
bad.
know if
That is bad form for an executive, I think.
I don't know if the fishing trip is accurate or if that was media using photos out of context.
I don't know,
That
that
one,
that part's debatable, but
yeah,
his overall behavior during Katrina was not what you would expect, especially having
yeah.
seen how he handled the 9/11 crisis. Yes, Katrina was not a terrorist attack. Okay, that's fine, granted. That was still one of, at the time, that was still one of the worst natural disasters to have happened on American soil.
It was a federal emergency,
Yeah,
like no doubt
it
about
was
it.
a federal emergency, and also his FEMA was
Yeah,
absolutely grotesque in how they handled things. And again, these are Bush appointees. So at that point, regardless of whether or not the appointees did the right or wrong thing, he's the one that appointed them. And as the leader, he is the one that ends up ultimately taking the blame for that.
yeah.
So moving past that, I vehemently disagree with his veto of expansions of stem cell research. Um, like, that was ridiculous to me. Um, Also, there was the whole thing with the Justice Department during midterms. He just dismissed several U.S. attorneys, basically saying that they weren't doing their jobs, but there was no actual demonstrable evidence presented that showed that they weren't doing their jobs. And I think that kind of caused some really unnecessary upheaval in the Justice Department. Whether or not that in and of itself had a long lasting effect on the JD as a whole, I would say is incredibly debatable. So, as far as a negative, this would be weighted pretty small to me. This is just a negative thing he did during his presidency. May not have had long lasting effects there. But the rest of these things that I'm gonna go through, and we're just gonna burn through them really quick. The Iraq invasion of 2003, completely unnecessary and based on a lie, and there's good evidence to show that they knew it was nonsense before the invasion. Um, Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay, enhanced interrogation techniques. Waterboarding is torture. Sorry. And and then the last thing, the Patriot Act and its establishment of FISA courts.
Yeah, that was bad.
That was horrendous. And so, based on all of that, even with all of the good political karma he built up with the initial handling of 9/11 and making useful steps towards immigration reform and stuff like that, personally, I rank him as a D.
I
Big,
I do want to give opposing views on a couple of the points you brought up just real
yeah,
quick.
yeah, sure.
So
I just look here and we've spent a half hour on this one person.
yeah, it'll be like a minute and a half
Okay, go
max.
for it. Go for it.
So for NIH increased funding, I actually kind of think that as a negative because there's enough information that NIH has put out that is effectively government propaganda. Like they do good work, but there's also just the concern and the fear that this is that they're towing the line for the sake of trying to control public opinion on certain issues. So I put that as like a moderately negative, not like a slight negative thing.
Okay.
The
Okay.
other one I would flip on is the stem cell thing. Is that during the time that was going on, that was what the constituents wanted him to do, was to veto. But more importantly, it's not blocking stem cell research. It was blocking the use of embryonic stem cell lines that were illegally harvested according to American medical ethics. So there were specific stem cell lines that were obtained from embryos that were not compliant with medical ethics in America. And they were trying to fund that. And that's what the bill was saying to fund, and that's what was vetoed. The
Okay.
last thing that I want to flip with you on is the increase of green energy and renewable energy. For the most part, that's kind of okay. The big problem with it is that it led to an explosion of ethanol use. And ethanol, it does not decrease the carbon footprint at all, but it actually increases the carbon footprint for how much it takes to manufacture and the
Right.
fact that it has less use. You get less miles per gallon out of it.
Though I
And
think the
yeah,
E85, I think you might be a little bit out of bounds on that one, just because E85 use and production didn't actually really, like, there was research invested into under the Bush administration, but the actual use, promotion, and production didn't happen until Obama.
true, but the 10% being added to your
Okay, okay.
standard,
Nope, nope. I'll give you that one. I'll give you that.
yeah,
Yeah, even that 10% was actually increasing our overall carbon footprint. Okay, nope. I'll grant you that. We're cool
yeah.
there.
And also everyone that had to redo their gas lines because their gas lines were melting in their vehicle.
Yeah, because ethanol reacts with the lining. But anyways, so excuse me. I rank him as a D. We've got a lot of information, and while he did do some good things, the overwhelming negative effects and negative things that he did during his presidency, I think, weight very heavily. Because No Child Left Behind, we are still having problems with that 20 years after it was passed. Patriot Act, we're almost 20 years out from that being passed. We still have problems with it. FISA courts, like, this is decades long problems after this president. And for that, I think he deserves a D. I don't think I think he falls slightly below average. And so he'd be like a D plus at best.
I'd say D plus if I was basing only on Patriot Act alone, and I did not even caring about anything else he did or didn't do.
Yeah.
Just
I
that puts you
don't
at
think I
least a
don't
D.
think he was the worst, because there are plenty of people, there are a couple of people on here that are just absolutely friggin' atrocious.
Yeah,
And we will get to those. Oh, believe you me, we'll get to those. Um but yeah, there are plenty of atrocious people on here. Um I don't think Bush is deserving of that ranking. He's definitely not an F, but he's nowhere near B, A, or nowhere close to S tier. That's for sure.
which stinks because I like him and I think he's a good guy. I just
True,
don't think
but
he was a good president.
right, and see that's what we're focusing on here. We're focusing on his actions as president, and so that's kind of what we're looking at there. And I think that's really the more important aspect that we got to focus on with it. All right,
Okay.
so moving on. Our next buddy up here. Oh,
It's is that
that's Buchanan.
you sure it's not Andy Serkis as the villain in whatever Jordan Peele's next movie is?
You know, I mean, could be.
Let's
So
decide after we see what he did because it might be both.
it might be both. Yeah. So this is James Buchanan. He was a Democrat that served as president from 1857 to 1861. Positives that I could find for his presidency, basically none. He was a high tariff supporting president. He stacked his cabinet with Southern slavery sympathizers, known as dough faces during the time, but it appeared as balanced because they were Northerners, but they were slavery sympathizers. Number one, he personally intervened or tried to intervene in the Supreme Court case of Dred Scott, seeking an even broader judgment against Scott than what was delivered, that would effectively render the Missouri Compromise of 1820 unconstitutional, allowing slavery to pop up in literally any state in the country at that point. And long story short, he pretty much did more than any other elected official to hasten the start of the Civil War, especially with how he handled the Bleeding Kansas period. With what was his name, John Brown, I think it was, who went through and just started killing people, started killing slave owners in Kansas.
I mean, not that we disagree with John Brown.
No, no, no. I do not dis. I do not dis. I might
Your point is that he
disagree.
should have just been left to do what he was doing without government intervention.
I don't necessarily know about that one. I'm not necessarily pro vigilante justice or anything like that. I'm not even pro just killing people. Um, I'm for the most part against it. I don't like the thought of just killing people willy nilly because you disagree with them. But at the same time, they're slave owners, and most of them were quite terrible to the people that they owned as property, and that in and of itself is abjectly flippin' despicable.
And one of the things that we will disagree on is that I wouldn't see it as vigilante justice. I would see it as a holy war, and it
This
was an
hey
appeal to
hey hey
heaven.
hey
So
political reformation here. We are not on the atheist reformation channel right now.
good point.
Keith, let's. So for me, Buchanan, solid F. Like this is where he belongs. He is quite frankly one of the worst presidents we have ever had.
Yeah, let's just take a moment to reflect on the fact that not only was he so racist that he wanted to intervene in the Dred Scott case, he also did not care enough about the Constitution checks and balances. He's like, nope, this is when it's time to burn the Constitution so that I can side pro slavery.
Exactly. I mean, we're not even talking about wrong side of history here. We're talking wrong side of everything.
Yeah.
Like, I'm pretty sure he even got out of the wrong side of the bed that morning. I mean, look at that hair. Just look at it. So, anyways, moving on to the next person, Jimmy Carter. So, Jimmy Carter. Now, everybody keep in mind, we are judging based on the individual's presidency, not what they did before gaining the office of the president or after. Jimmy Carter
We're
is a wonderful man, still building homes for Habitat for Humanity, and the man is nearly a century old. Like the man is a national treasure.
we're
But
criticizing this
w-
fantastic human being's terrible presidency.
yes, we are criticizing his terrible presidency. Um, so let's take a look at it now. Again, we're gonna start with the positives because there were some positives under the Carter administration. There were not a lot, uh, and this initial point is probably debatable. I, to some degree, I agree with the establishment of the Department of Energy. I'm not generally one for expanding government influence or expanding the central government because I do side more on the classical libertarian side of things, not the modern libertarian side of things. Um, which I hate to say it, there are some aspects of like the hardcore extremist modern liberals that I hate to say starts to kind of border on neo-fascism a little bit.
I
Just be,
mean, it does.
just because the like the overwhelming nationalism, it's getting pretty bad. Like that whole party needs a dramatic overhaul.
That's actually kind of geographically isolated because in
True,
Texas
but
that's a problem. Up where
very
I'm at
much a problem.
now, it's the other end of the spectrum where there's a lot of anarchists that just think that everything will magic itself together.
Yeah, but anyways, we're not. We will do a tier list of of maybe not political parties, but we'll do a tier list of forms of government later on. So like I said, it depends on where you fall in the expansion of government oversight. I do think that the Department of Energy and regulating oil industries, regulating what they do to the environment, and establishing the EPA, I do think that falls under a legitimate role of government, because what these companies do in these rural areas without telling people is a bad thing. There has never been an instance where big oil has come to a town. There's been a boom for a few years, there's been some economic improvement, but almost every single time we find out some heinous crap happened on the environmental side of things, like 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And it was because of corners they cut, shady crap they did. And I think, I think at that point, the Department of Energy has a purpose there, has a legitimate governmental purpose there. Now, do I think that in recent years there have been some gross over expansions of what they have the power to do and say? Yes. But those expansions did not happen under Carter. Those would fall under, I think those would firmly fall under policies of those presidents, because those are things those presidents actively did. But anyways, continuing on, a lot of the few positives, I think this stems from, at least when he was in office as president, was his just overall combativeness, because he didn't take phone calls, he wouldn't return them, was constantly insulting people and yelling and screaming at people, according to a lot of different people that were in the White House at that time. And I think that is part of what led to the overall negatives. A couple of small positives, though. He was very friendly to home brewers like myself. I like to brew my own beer, and ferment my own, uh, mead, basically, honey wine, not actual wine. That's just too much of a complicated process for me to mess with, and I live in the wrong climate for it. uh, but yeah, he deregulated the beer industry a bit. That allowed malt, hops, yeast. It allowed them to be sold by these companies to home brewers for the first time since 1930, like since Prohibition ended. Actually, since the start of Prohibition, and Prohibition was repealed in 1933, and he undid that in 1978. So that was a Prohibition holdover that lasted for another 45 years.
I mean, that's good. Yeah, I didn't know
Uh,
about that.
Yep. He also succeeded in, securing actual movement forward in comprehensive bans of nuclear tests, because the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty in 1979, and he finally, uh, he was the first president. He was the only president to actually issue full presidential pardons to people who dodged the draft during Vietnam.
Hmm.
And so I think those are all positives. Now, they're relatively small positives. Those are things that were all essentially done by executive action and not through bipartisan support and actually having bills go through the legislative process and all that. Here's where we get to the negatives: the energy crisis of 1977. Now, to some extent, I think it's debatable whether or not it's actually a negative for Carter, despite the fact that it happened during his presidency, as to whether or not his actual actions had an overall negative impact on that. Um, the Iran hostage crisis, that was not very well handled under his presidency. And then finally, the 1978 Superfund law. I think that was an overwhelming negative for the American people at that point. Yes, it did actually help some of the residents of Love Canal, but this is a program that remains criminally underfunded and is consistently used as an excuse to just condemn communities, just condemn every structure within them. And then they give the residents next to nothing to move, to leave their property. Sometimes these homes have been in families for multiple generations, and then they don't actually do anything to correct the environmental disaster, and they don't go after the company for industrial malpractice. And so for that, for me, I would kind of rank him as a D, because not a lot of positives, and the positives that were there were small, and the bad things, like especially the Superfund law, that's something we are still finding out about, some of the terrible underhanded crap that's happening underneath that law, underneath that legislation, and there's been no real expansion to it since 1978. This is literally just the consequences of the bill that passed through Congress in 78 and Carter signing it. And for that, as a president, I kind of put him in the same boat as Bush. I put him as a D.
Yeah, I'd say that's fair. I would consider the DEA to be a negative though, but yeah,
You'd consider what to be a negative?
the Department of Energy.
Oh,
Sorry, I
oh,
was
okay.
watching. Yeah,
The DOE. Okay. The DEA, yeah, that's the Drug Enforcement Agency. That's something totally different.
it's
Uh,
also a negative, but
yeah, I agree. So our next buddy here is Chester A. Arthur,
who?
the 21st president of the United States.
Yeah.
You've watched Die Hard 3. Everybody knows who Chester A. Arthur is. At least Die Hard fans do. Die Hard fans do, because that guy, that trucker Jerry, that was just like a relative font of wonderfully useless information about the aqueduct system. Anyways, so Chester Arthur, uh, positives. He did call for an abolition of excise taxes on all products except alcohol, and which I think removing the excise tax on alcohol, I think kind of makes sense that he left it on there, because at the time, up until Prohibition, um, it was it made up like 20% of our GDP at that point. Taxes on alcohol made up 20% of our GDP, which is insane. But
So is it because the tax was so high on alcohol, or was it because so many people drank so much?
yes,
Both.
it
Okay.
was both. Oh my gosh. No, the average level of alcohol consumption, like throughout American history up until Prohibition, was insane. Like the Constitution, like the party after the ratification of the Constitution, like it talked about upwards of 50 casks of wine that they emptied, and cask being like about a 3-gallon barrel at that time. And so we're talking 180 gallons of wine for a party that had an attendance of about 30.
So the Americans were essentially walking pate.
Dude, you have no idea. Like, I'm pretty sure there were I'm pretty sure there were people that who served in office whose livers were pickled. Like, not even joking. He did simplify the tariff structure, and for me, tariffs historically are kind of a big thing. Um, you know, it was it was extremely convoluted and complex at that time, even in the 1880s. And I didn't run through that. So Chester A. Arthur, 21st president, served from 1881 to 1885. He was a Republican. Anyway, so those are the only real positives I could find for him. Negatives, on the other hand, um, is where we start to get some pretty bad stuff. Now, this first one, I'm not entirely convinced is a negative, because it's, I don't know. Anyway, the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1882. It only benefited very specific localities. Like it was geared towards essentially giving money to rich communities. Um, and at that time, they were giving them an allotment of $19 million, which was unheard of. That was the largest allotment given to a hyper specific public funding bill in American history at that point. Which, to balance that out against today's dollars, that would be about a little over $500 million. And in Arthur's defense, he did veto it. He did veto it. He tried to veto it. He did go against his own party, and that would. But the problem was the very next day, Congress overrode him.
But
Um,
how's that his fault?
right? No, no, no. I don't really see it as his fault. That's why I was saying it's like I don't really think it's his fault, but I do think it is worth noting. So I think I really just kind of typed it in the wrong place. So while the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1882 was a bad thing overall, it was something that he, as president, tried to stop.
I
Anyways,
mean, at the time, it's we're talking about pre-cars, like pre-automobile
mm-hmm.
for the most people. So this is essentially an infrastructure bill.
To an extent, however, it is the equivalent of $552 million in today's dollars to very specific, already wealthy communities.
Yeah, I mean it's not a good thing, but I'm just trying to like think of it historically. But yeah, it's good for him for vetoing it. Good for him for being anti-tax.
Yeah. Now well, he's not entirely anti-tax. Herein lies the rub. The Immigration Act of 1882. He
Okay.
instituted a sweeping tax on immigrants. It wasn't much. It was like a nickel or something like that. But still, it was a sweeping tax on immigrants coming into the United States that they were not notified of beforehand. It's just anybody that shows up after a certain date has to pay, whether they know it or not. And this is at a time where ocean travel took months and sometimes upwards of a year in certain circumstances, depending on weather. As well as discriminating against those that were mentally ill or, as what was referred to in the bill, intellectually disabled. Basically, disallowing them from immigrating into this country purely based on that factor.
It's not good.
No,
It's
it's
not
not
good.
good. It's not good. And
But you got to look at things in context. It's not the way that it sounds under today's stuff. So, like, first of all, when we're talking about like a nickel's worth of tax, we're dealing with essentially trying to make immigration self-funded so that you can further
right, and
taxation.
I get where that's coming from.
Yeah,
However, there were no protections put into place to essentially grandfather access to those who were already underway to the United States based on the ship's manifest. They were just charged.
yeah. And then as far as the mental illness, you also got to look at when we're dealing with 19th century. We're dealing with 19th century here, right?
Yeah, 1880s.
Yeah, 19th century mental health. What we're talking about is not people with, you know, stress or anxiety disorders that we would be able to identify. The only way you're identifying someone as mentally ill at those points
Is if
is
they're
whenever
severely developmentally disabled or
they're
criminally
committed
insane.
they're committed into a facility where they're essentially going to live in prison and be tortured every day for the rest of their life.
True, but they weren't aware of the torture that was going on in a lot of places, or at least like government officials were not as aware.
Right. By
There's actually
today's standards, we would call it torture. Back then, they would have called
oh
it
for sure,
treatment.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But still, didn't it goes against the tenets of what makes America America at that point. To
It
deny
does, but
to
we
deny
also have
someone purely based on that fact alone.
right, but we also have the discussion about whether people who are immigrating should be able to be able to provide for themselves. What are you going to be able to have a job? Are you going to be able to take care of yourself? Those kinds of things. And the people who were qualifying as mentally ill at this time frame, there is 0% chance that they would have ever been able to take care of themselves because we have a
No,
much more
but still, there's
expanded understanding of mental health care today.
but still, what would be easily recognizable as mental illness back then is still the types of mental illness that we see today, where these individuals are unable to care for themselves, and they do still live at home with family because they have to, because they are unable to function in what we consider society today. They're unable to function in a way that is beneficial to them.
Okay,
And
so I haven't done a deep dive in the law, but is it saying that we would basically take the family and then everyone who was not mentally ill could become an American and everyone who was not would be sent back to their home country? Or was this bill written in a way to prevent countries from taking people who were essentially wards of the state, loading them up on boats, and then sending them to America for us to take care of them because they weren't going to take care of them in their home country.
So the problem is, it was the Immigration Act of 1882 is worded so vaguely
Okay.
that it could be applied to literally any situation. While it may have been written with the intent of preventing that, of just being used as a dumping ground,
Yeah.
um, because their home country refused to take care of them and just sent them to us. While that may have been the spirit behind it, I don't see where any primary sources of the day actually state that. It's worded so vaguely that, and there were also documented instances of people turning away mentally ill individuals at the port, putting them back on the boat, and actually separating families at that point.
Oh, okay. That's messed up.
Now,
Yeah.
granted, while those were actions of immigration officials on the docks at places like Ellis Island, and and Port of Galveston and places like that, it it's still a law that was signed in under Arthur at that point. And then the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which came on the heels of the Immigration Act.
Yeah. Screw that guy.
Now, he was initially opposed to it, but he acquiesced to partisan pressure and signed it later on. So I kind of give him a D.
Yeah. I mean,
I don't think he is so horrendous as Buchanan. While there are bad things, like the Immigration Act, largely a bad thing. China's Exclusion Act, wholly bad thing. It was
not
he.
only is it a bad thing, but it led to probably the next 60 to 70 years of anti-Asian sentiment in America, which
I agree.
we're kind of still just coping with now.
I agree. I agree. I'm just
But
not.
that was the starting point of when it happened.
Yeah, I'm just not sure it qualifies him to be in with the worst of the worst people like Buchanan.
Yeah.
Like, he's definitely low on the D scale. He's definitely not like above either of those two by any stretch of the imagination. He's like a distant D. He's a D in that there is 1 point separating him from being an F, I think.
And that one point is entirely made up of cutting taxes.
And simplifying tariffs.
Yeah. I mean, the tariffs are taxes, essentially.
They are. They are. They are.
Yeah.
So our next buddy up here is Grover Cleveland. He's a Democrat. He served from 1885 to 1889 in his first term. Second term from 1893 to 1897. Um, so positives, not many, very few, like pretty much none. Though he did overturn an executive order by Chester Arthur, um, that some people are not even entirely sure Arthur actually signed. It just started happening,
Hmm.
and they're thinking the executive order was put in after the fact. But we're not going to get into that one because it's getting like way into like political conspiracy territory. Anyways, um, that was allowing encroachment of Native American land in the Dakotas.
Hmm.
Cleveland overturned that.
Okay.
However, here's where we get to the bad. Vetoed hundreds of bills petitioning for pensions for Civil War veterans. Vetoed the Texas Seed Bill that would have helped address a massive agricultural crisis that was causing famine in parts of Texas during his presidency. He extended the Chinese Exclusion Act and then expanded it with the Scott Act in 1888. Let's see, the Dawes Act, which was essentially a legislative measure to forcibly assimilate Native American people into white society. He campaigned against the Lodge Bill, something that was designed to expand the protection of voting rights by appointing federal supervisors of congressional elections, provided that the citizens of a district petitioned for one to be sent. and then successfully repealed the Enforcement Act of 1871 in 1894, which removed many federal election protections at that time. Those are bad, okay?
Yeah, that's not good.
I honestly kind of put him in an F tier.
Yeah, it sounded like it.
Like, he's better than Buchanan, but not much. Like, Buchanan is, like, if I had another tier that was just labeled Hell tier, Buchanan would be there.
All alone.
No, no, no. He'd have a buddy. He'd have a buddy. He'd have a buddy to
Yeah,
burn
one
with
buddy.
together. And here's the thing, I'm advocating for a Hell tier as an atheist. That's how much I dislike Buchanan and his soon to be butt buddy in there.
No
So
pun intended.
no, no pun intended. Butt buddy, bosom buddy. That's all I'm talking about there. I'm not
Okay.
speaking towards any particular thing or being trying to be disparaging towards anyone. So butt buddy is in like friends that are joined at the hip. Anyways,
I have some dried kiwis. I'm gonna have one now.
oh dude, man, I wish I had some papaya spears. Turd. Anyway, our next friend up here is Bill Clinton. God, that crap is so loud, dude.
Sorry.
Just open it and leave it open. My God. It's okay. It's okay. We didn't know. So positives. CHIP. I think CHIP was beneficial in 1997. The
Chip.
the state children's health insurance program.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
That
I'm
was
cool with that.
that
That's a
that
good
that
one.
was a big positive for him.
I'm very anti like federal programs and like
But
like
that but
um,
but that
government
went
medical,
pure
but that's a good program.
and that went purely towards assisting low income families. Like there were
Yeah,
no provisions in the bill to benefit political cronies. Like that was a very solid bill that had good bipartisan support. That was one of the best things Bill Clinton ever did.
yeah. If you're not covered, if you have children and they're not covered by your insurance,
Guess what? We're
then
going
they
to
don't
cover
have
it.
to go without medical care. That's all
Exactly.
it's about.
Exactly. It was a very good thing.
It was
It,
kind of a
it was
brilliant with pop culture.
it really was. Anyways,
No, I was talking about as another point. He was really in tune with pop culture
oh
in terms
yeah.
of like
Oh
how to
yeah.
present himself.
Like for sure. Like if the internet had been as big then as it is now, like he would have been like the inaugural rock the vote candidate kind of guy. For sure. For sure. He was very in tune with pop culture. Um Now, here's where it might get a little controversial. I, for one, in its initial form, when it was signed into law in 1994, not the things that have happened since then, but what happened in 94 and throughout Clinton's presidency, not the expansions that happened later on, I think NAFTA was a good thing in the onset. It
Okay.
made it made trade easier between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Did it
I mean,
have
it picked winners and losers, but I'm not
yeah,
going to argue with you.
but the winner and loser picking, I think that happened later on. I think that started to happen mostly in the 2000s when with the expansions. Like the onset of NAFTA was not as it was not the grotesque monster it's become.
Yeah.
And so I think it was it was positively spirited even though now today it's had more of a negative outcome, but that's again been by appointees and presidents outside of Clinton's presidency. Because like Bush used parts of NAFTA to justify and expand the Patriot Act. Like that was some heinous crap.
I just know that like the whole conversation economically about World Trade Organization and having unfair uh, preferences for specific companies was tied into NAFTA back in like 98, 99. So
Okay, okay.
that part of it would have been pre, but I don't know
Okay,
specifically in details.
well, if it was 98, 99, and that's where the winners and losers started happening, then I guess we'll say that as a neutral. Started as a positive, became a negative. It kind of cancels itself out, I guess. So it's more of
Yeah.
a neutral point then, which became the Foster Care Independence Act in '99. That was a great thing.
Okay.
That streamlined the adoption process, um, put more oversight into foster care programs to cut back on abuse, and expanded foster care to get more kids into good homes, even just as fosters. I think that overall was a net positive. And then, of course, the expansion or the streamlining of the adoption process and making the process easier and less convoluted. It didn't make it any less strict, but it did make it less convoluted, and that was the Adoption and Safe Families Act in '97. He did a lot for underprivileged youths and low income families during both terms. Oddly,
Yeah, I
usually,
know a lot of people talked about how he was kind of the president for single moms. That was like a thing that people said. Like,
yeah. Like if you were a low income family, single mom, underprivileged youth, like man, Bill Clinton had your back. Bill Clinton's the reason why I had health insurance in elementary school. He's the whole reason I was able to get glasses in fifth grade. I mean, so because that wouldn't have happened without Chip. So like for me, like those are some pretty extreme positives on the domestic front for Bill Clinton.
yeah.
Now here's where we get into the negatives. Don't ask, don't tell. It effectively told LGBTQ plus members to hide their identities while serving in the military.
And the thing is, it was already essentially policy within the military, but it wasn't codified.
No, but then he codified it, which made it
Yeah.
worse. Uh, Whitewater, to me, that's kind of debatable. I don't think anything really happened in it, and I don't think anything came from it. So while yes, a scandal happened during his presidency as far as Whitewater goes, I don't see it as an overall like a doom and gloom, a heavily weighted negative for him. Basically, is it a negative? Yes, but like maybe 1 or 2 points. Nothing, nothing extreme. The Defense of Marriage Act in 1996, which federally defined marriage to exclude the LGBTQ plus community. His claim was that it was to prevent the possible passage of a constitutional amendment banning same sex marriage. Sorry, that is flimsy at best. There was no evidence to suggest that that was ever pushed for. There was like one representative, like one hardcore, um, and like anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ plus representative in the House that tried to push for an amendment. It had no chance of passing in the House ever.
So I don't understand the logic. I'm going to pass a law to outlaw gay marriage so that they can't pass an amendment that outlaws it.
Exactly, it's stupid because
Oh,
that
okay.
wouldn't prevent the passage of an amendment if an amendment was going to pass. Because look at prohibition. The 18th Amendment passed, and yet still the Volstead Act was made into law immediately after that. So I'm sorry, like the logic isn't there.
Yeah.
That's a big negative for me. Um, and I'm not even a member of that community. Like personally speaking, I'm not a member of that community, but I do very much support it because I have friends and family that are part of that community. Um, I personally I don't care about the sex scandals, but I do acknowledge that people would consider the Lewinsky scandal, the Paula Jones scandal. Now, the Paula Jones thing, okay, that one is a negative for me because there were accusations of sexual assault.
Yeah. I was like, I care.
Like
I'm
like that one I
really
care
care
about.
about
If
those.
if the president is going around sexually assaulting people, okay, yes, that needs to be addressed.
That was prior to presidency, though, right? That was
Uh,
still when he was governor.
I think so. I think so. I guess it came out when he was president.
Yeah,
It
the
came to light.
problem, and
Now,
just to,
as far as the Lewinsky thing, I'm sorry, they were two consenting adults that got jiggy in the Oval Office. I don't care. That's that's but
disagree with you. I don't care that it happened. I care that he lied.
Okay, yes, I care that he lied. I do care that he lied. That I care about, and that's why he was impeached. But he also wasn't convicted. So,
Yeah.
um, I do care that he lied. I don't care that he got laid. I don't. It's the same thing with JFK. I don't care that he was boinking everybody from Rita Hayworth to Marilyn Monroe. I don't care.
But you would care if the CIA poisoned Marilyn Monroe. Not
Yes, I
saying that
would.
happened. I'm saying
No, no, no.
if it.
If that had happened, yes. If that were actually discovered to be true, yes, then I would have a problem with it because then that's taking action, that's killing someone to preserve some imagined puritanical integrity that doesn't actually matter.
Yeah. And
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 this
when
is
it comes
this
to
is coming from someone who's monogamist. I do not agree with with polyamory. I don't have anything against it if people are able to have productive and fulfilling relationships. More power to you. I'm all for it. Just me personally, I'm a serial monogamist. I guess I
and the thing that I have more of a problem with because a lot of the actions that are very concerning and troubling when it comes to his behavior and treatment toward women were
yes.
pre-presidency, so I'm not going to count those in with
Okay,
it.
so
What I
then we dropped the Paula Jones thing entirely because that was
but
pre-presidency.
well, the problem was is that during presidency, the role of the first lady was character assassinating any of the accusers while those cases were ongoing.
True, but at that point, that was not at the behest of Bill. That was entirely Hillary. And I'm sorry, I don't think we can hold Bill accountable for what Hillary did.
That's fair.
So like that's on her. I disagree with using that against him. So
So lying to the grand
as
jury
far
is
as
all we
I'm
got.
concerned, the actual occurrences that led to the sex scandal were prior to presidency. I don't believe in really judging those. He lied to Congress when it came to the Lewinsky thing. Okay, so that's a negative, not a huge negative, but it's still a negative because it was effectively a presidential white lie. He lied about getting laid. Um, and then here's the biggest negative for me out of the whole thing. You already know what it is.
I probably don't because I know what my two biggest things are, and I don't think you're going to bring them up.
The 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill.
That's a bad one.
That is a
And
massive negative
yep.
because that led to racial profiling, that led to racially charged policing, that led to massive racial disparities at every level of criminal justice.
Mm-hmm.
And that was an overwhelming negative for his
Super
presidency.
predators.
Yeah. Now granted, I don't think that undoes every positive, but I do think that at the very least firmly plants him in the C category.
I'm going to kick them off into D category real quick.
Okay, let's go for it. Let's hear
Janet Reno.
it.
Come on, man. Waco.
Yeah.
Okay. And then here's the one that's definitely going to kick over into D territory, if not F territory. Double hit, foreign policy, Rwanda, Somalia.
Yeah, that's D.
Yeah, we let a whole genocide happen and didn't do anything because Kurt Cobain died the day before.
Yep. Now, I think he's better than Arthur, but not by much. Like,
Yeah.
if Arthur is 1 point above being in the F category, Bill is 2. Maybe 1.5. Because Rwanda and Somalia right there. Like, the issues in Mogadishu were absolutely terrible.
We have a special guest that's trying to visit.
Oh, who is it?
You can come in.
Is it Bronson?
Yes.
I knew it. It's always Bronson. It's always Bronson. Anyways, uh, for anybody who comes over to us from the Atheist Reformation, everybody knows Bronson. He is Big Cat. Anyway.
Now he's going to sit on the beanbag and you'll never see him.
Yeah, that black fur blends in with that brown beanbag pretty well. Anyways, next on the block, Calvin Coolidge.
Coolidge College.
So he was Republican president from 1923 to 1929. And here's the positives. Largely responsible for the Roaring Twenties because he posted cabinet members who took a more laissez-faire approach to regulating businesses. They weren't opposed to regulating them and did do some meaningful regulation, but they didn't go over the top with a lot of things.
Yeah.
Big positive for me is that he was largely hands off. He rightly believed the president of the United States to be more of a figurehead for the country, a public face, a singular public face for the country, rather than a legislator. He firmly believed in separation of powers. That's a big positive for me. He reduced income tax burdens exclusively on low income citizens. And the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 um, actually made moves to return land to First Nations people. And then the Dawes Plan, which further expanded upon that act. Now, negatives, he pulled a George W. Bush, or rather, George W. Bush pulled a Calvin Coolidge. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. Abandoned the country to literally go on a fishing trip that was entirely a bait and switch by the South Dakota government to get Mount Rushmore built.
No pun intended about bait and switch.
Oh no, pun very much intended. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think that puts him as, I'm going to say, our first B tier. Because while the Mississippi flood was like one of the worst natural disasters we ever had, overall, like, some very, very positive things happened under his presidency.
Yeah. And it's not like we had, airplane travel that was easily accessible where he could have flown down and done anything.
Right, exactly. This was 1927. Like, air travel was still not really even a thing.
He could have taken a train and then shown up for no cameras, like some old like phosphorus bulbs to flash his photo and print the next day. Like, what was he going to do there?
Yeah, exactly.
That the National Guard couldn't do.
Right, exactly. So do you agree with the B tier classification, or should I bring him down to a C?
I'm not seeing anything negatives, and although like typically there's not a lot of people loving on Coolidge, I mean, might as well put him as a B if there's no negatives really, other than the
Okay, yeah, B tier it is. B tier it is. Because, like, Mississippi flood was a bad thing. Because even after he got back from the fishing trip, he never said anything for or against anything. He just didn't do anything. And so that's where it becomes a negative for me. But it doesn't become enough of a negative to, like, really drag him down. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So our next friend is old Dapper Dan himself, aka Herbert Hoover.
Which everyone hates him, but he's not that terrible.
He's not that terrible, but there's a lot of negatives to his presidency. Like, as an individual, he wasn't a terrible person, again, like Jimmy Carter, but was not a very good president. I do think he was a better president than Carter, though.
Yeah.
Anyway, served from 1929 to 1933, one term. Positives, he passed he established the Federal Farm and passed the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1929 to stabilize farm prices because there was some shady price fixing going on, trying to establish agricultural monopolies since the industrial monopolies were
I
or have been broken up. And
I
so if
disagree with the philosophy about that. Like, just in my political philosophy, everything about that, I disagree with the bill. But the reality of it during that time is
it was
people were
necessary,
going to starve to death if they didn't have a solution.
it was necessary.
Yeah.
He also maintained a lot of non-interventionist policies and walked back a lot of the policies under Teddy Roosevelt, which, let's be honest, they were imperialistic, and Teddy was very jingoistic. He was very much a war hawk. He wanted to fight anyone and everyone as much as he could. No other president has challenged visiting foreign heads of state to boxing matches in the White House basement.
But I think that our country would be better if they did.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, no more wars. It just has to be, 10 rounds, get in the ring, glove up, and nut up. Absolutely. Just instead of wars, slugfest.
I 100% agree.
Yeah, make the people who are responsible for the BS actually, get some skin in the game, so to speak, both
And you know what? It
literally
might actually
and
be cheaper.
figuratively.
Whoever loses has to pay the other country's, fiscal budget that year.
There you go. There
That's
you go.
probably cheaper than maintaining like all the weapons for military
I
and,
agree
and paying the
wholeheartedly.
cost of. Yeah.
Anyways, let's get on to the negatives. Terrible handling of the stock market crash of 1929. Terrible handling.
When was he president?
29 to 33. He was
Okay.
elected, like, he was inaugurated 10 months before the stock market crash.
Okay.
Like, he knew it was coming.
And he
He
couldn't have caused. He didn't cause
he
it,
did
but
not cause
he.
it. I'm not saying
Yeah.
he caused it. That's why I said it's terrible handling, not that he was the cause of it. So it's not as much of a negative as it could be.
Yeah. I just don't know what
Um,
he could have done differently.
some very, very terrible policy stances when it came to prohibition, because he did everything he can to avoid responsibility with
Mm.
when it came to prohibition and the Volstead Act. So he established the Wickersham Commission that was to analyze the policy's effectiveness, despite there being widespread public knowledge from coast to coast that showed that prohibition and the Volstead Act were single-handedly responsible for increases in criminality nationwide and were the reason we had organized crime start in this country.
Yeah.
That was already a known quantity, but Hoover's like, "Oh, we don't know what's going on. Let's establish a commission."
And thus forms the trope of every politician forming a committee when they don't
Yep,
know what to do.
yep, exactly. He refused to push for a federal anti-lynching law, and also continued pursuing what was referred to as the Lily White strategy. His way to try and break Democrat control in the South was he didn't just not appoint black Americans to federal positions in the Republican Party, he actively removed them from leadership roles.
It's pretty bad.
Yeah, that's really bad. Now, granted, some of that is due to partisan pressure.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, that plays out like the tell me you're racist without telling me you're racist.
exactly. That's exactly what that is. So I think that puts him as a low C. Like, the non-interventionism was a really good thing. Walking back a lot of the imperialistic policies of Teddy Roosevelt was a good thing. Stabilizing farm prices and preventing, at least staving off the mass famine that happened during the Depression. Those are all pretty big positives. No, actually, you know what? No, I'll put him as D tier. I'm gonna put him in D. just above Chester A. Arthur, but below Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
And actually, Bill Clinton was better than Jimmy Carter.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I would put him in front of Bush, but in all honesty, I think the two are neck and neck on that one.
Yeah, they're really kind of a wash.
Yeah, these two are a wash.
But I was gonna say, like, the Iran hostage situation, like that led to just as much international instability as us ignoring Rwanda.
Exactly. Anyways, if not more, because that's part of what ended up causing like the overwhelming, grotesque religious reformation and downfall of Iran as a society.
Yeah, so for any of the viewers that are familiar with the memes that show like 1970s Tehran, where it's like super progressive and women are wearing skirts and going to college and reading books and are studying to be doctors, yeah, that stopped because of Carter.
Uh huh. Maybe not solely because of Carter, but Carter did a lot of things to push that forward. He didn't
Yeah.
actively campaign for it, but his actions as president directly led to it.
So when you hear people talking about like ranking presidents as being strong leaders or poor leaders in international situations, those are the kinds of effects that you could see happening.
Yeah.
So when you hear people saying like, "Oh, well, you're not a strong enough leader when you're dealing with other countries,"
Mm-hmm.
that's what they're kind of afraid of happening.
Exactly. Carter was very weak in foreign policy. Anyways, we're done with Herbert Hoover. Our next friend up, that's William Henry Harrison. He died in office 30 days after inauguration. Sorry, we're skipping him. Uh,
God tier.
yeah.
Showed up, did everything perfect, decided I'm out, guys.
Right. Yeah. Showed up, did nothing, died. That's almost that Henry VIII trope. You know, divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived.
Yeah.
Did nothing, showed up, died. Anyways, Dwight David Eisenhower, Republican, served from 1953 to 1961. Positives: the Federal Highway Act of 1956. It codified the interstate highways and did because automobile travel was becoming a really big thing, and that did need to be addressed. And I think the federal highway system is an overall positive thing for the country because and I think it's also a legitimate role of government because remember this is interstate commerce, so the states shouldn't have to bear all the burden of maintaining those roads between states and then having this like grotesque difference between one state and the next because one state is um, wealthy and can build roads all over the place, but another state is largely rural and exports to other states most of its product and doesn't bring as much money back in. And so having
It's
that,
also kind of necessary because we're not allowed to ship things from state to state by water.
mm-hmm,
For
exactly.
those of you that know, there's a law that prevents that.
Yep. Next, even though it was unsuccessful, his 1953 Chance for Peace speech was very good. He was a very good orator. He actively campaigned for peace with
I mean, he had
communist
seen
countries.
war,
Yeah,
so he
exactly. He
knew.
had seen war up close. Like he wasn't just a general. Everybody knows him as a general of World War II. That man's career went back to I think World War One.
Yeah, he was a pretty hands-on military leader. So he was like, "Yeah, we need peace. This is
Exactly.
bad."
Like he presided over D-Day. He saw what happened there. He like that's yeah. He did not want to fight because he knew just how terrible war could be on a massive global scale. Um, the Civil Rights Act of 19 acts of 1957 and 1960. Those were great positive things. In particular, after the 1957 Civil Rights Act, he when Arkansas Governor Orville Phobos tried to combat it and basically, essentially, in some cases, with calling for armed insurrection. Um, Eisenhower stepped in and forced Phobos to obey the court order to allow integrations of the Arkansas public school system.
Yeah.
That was strong domestic leadership there. And then for for this may be debatable for people. He admitted Alaska and Hawaii as states in '59. Hawaii was already a protectorate at that point, like a severe protectorate, and had been petitioning for annexation since Sanford Dole had led his grotesque coup against Queen Liliuokalani. But that wasn't Eisenhower's fault. Eisenhower had no part in that.
Yeah.
So at that point, he was just allowing annexation of Hawaii because it was already basically a state as far as everything else was concerned. Now, the formation of Hawaii as a state, I vehemently disagree with. Sanford Dole was a terrible person. What happened there should not have happened. I think today, Hawaii probably still should be a sovereign nation. Uh, but that does not fall at the feet of Eisenhower. So, by admitting them as a state, by annexing them officially, that garnered them a lot of federal protections that they didn't have before. And so I think that's an overall positive. Negatives. The U-2 spy plane incident in 1960. He did not have a very good response to that on foreign policy. Again, we're talking about weak leadership as in foreign policy. He legitimized the dictatorial rule of fascist Francisco Franco in Spain with the Pact of Madrid in 1953. And then this goes more towards the atheist reformation, but this is still a thing that he did, and it was the unconstitutional promotion of Christianity over other religions on money, and then campaigning and then changing the national motto to "In God We Trust."
How much of that was him, and how much of that was the Senate?
They were pretty intertwined there.
Because that had a lot to do with the anti-communists.
Those were things that he actively advocated for and pushed for.
Yeah.
So I mean, Eisenhower is as much to blame as they are.
Okay.
So for me, that puts Eisenhower at a C. An average president, basically.
And then also the thing where he made the deal with the aliens for making hybrid humans.
Really?
Or was that just the last season of American Horror Story?
That was probably AHS. I don't even watch that show. I don't know.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So I'm gonna put him as a C tier. Average president. Quite a few positives, few negatives. Nothing truly terrible or amazing one way or the other.
Although we should do a deep dive in the U-2 spy plane incident.
We should at some point. That's a really cool political incident right there.
Yeah.
Almost as cool as Bay of Pigs.
But no one really talks about it. There's lots of movies about Bay of Pigs. There's a couple movies about the Iran hostage
thing. You know who what nobody talks about? The Gulf of Tonkin incidents.
They do not in movies and stuff, but there are a lot of discussions about them.
There are discussions, but there's nowhere near the coverage that there should be. But anyways, next up is William Howard Taft. I recognize that mug anywhere. Yeah.
No, he did not get stuck in the bathtub.
Yes, that was a political cartoon that turned into an urban legend.
An early example of fat shaming.
Yeah. So William Howard Taft, Republican, served from 1909 to 1913. Positives, he continued Roosevelt's trust-busting policies. He managed to break up the U.S. steel monopoly, which was predatory toward its workers, and basically was slave labor with minimal compensation.
Again, one of those things where it's like philosophically, on paper, I don't see that I would agree with it, but in terms of the practicality,
it was absolutely
what was going on.
It was
necessary.
Yeah, very much so. So negatives. He openly spoke about what he referred to as his Southern policy in his inaugural address. publicly stating his refusal to appoint black Americans to federal positions, which was wildly different from the policy um, of Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Protectionist policies, where he started using tariffs as a weapon, and then the Dingley Tariff Act that resulted in the institution of the 16th Amendment, which created the income tax.
That's the worst. That right there.
So,
I I'd say between that and starting the way he appointed officials in the South to appease the other parties,
uh-huh,
I'd say that puts him in D territory.
I agree. Definitely better than Arthur, though.
Yeah, I think possibly better than Carter.
I don't know. The racism thing really
You know what?
is a big
Yeah,
turn off there.
racism and income tax. Nope, that's going to be worse than Carter.
Yeah, for sure. Not by a whole lot, like 2 or 3 points. Had to take my allergy medication. I'm starting to get like itchy sniffles. It's weird. Next friend on the list, that is Millard Fillmore, I believe.
Who is not a duck?
Nope, that is just a comic called Mallard Fillmore. I did like the play on it
Fillmore.
though.
Yeah.
Anyways, Millard Fillmore was a member of the Whig Party, WHIG, and served as president from 1850 to 1853. The Whig Party is what eventually matriculated into and formed the Republican Party, though they did do some really heinous crap beforehand, which led to the dissolution of the party. But we'll get into that later. So, Millard Fillmore. Positives. He showed and voiced support for Dorothea Dix and her proposal of issuing land grants as a way to fund asyla or asylums, depending on how you want to interpret that word, for indigent mentally ill patients in 1850. This is not talking about the pros or cons of how we treated the mentally ill um, during that time. This was a move advocated for by someone who believed strongly in positive care for mentally ill patients with Dorothy Dix. Now, granted, the proposal didn't ever go anywhere, but Fillmore is one of the only presidents to actually recognize a need for some form of mental health reform. And so I think the fact that he recognized it and advocated for it despite its failure is a net positive.
Yeah.
Because it showed strong leadership in that he recognized there was a need to reform mental health in this country, even as early as 1850. He was a longtime supporter of developing national infrastructure. He subsidized multiple public works projects, such as the Sault Ste. Marie Canal and the Illinois Central Railroad. Negatives, and these are some pretty big negatives. He initiated the forced globalization of Japan by sending off the Perry expedition, even though they didn't arrive until his predecessor took office, or his successor took office. My bad.
So
Uh,
what? Tell me what the reason that is a negative.
uh, because number one, it was a drastically imperialist move to basically force Japan to start trading with people in the world. Like, it was literally America swinging the big economic dick and saying, "Hey, you're going to do this." It's not the
Okay.
it's not the place of the United States to go to a sovereign nation and say, "Hey, you're going to trade with us, whether you
Okay,
like
but
it or
that's
not."
that's removing a pretty big thing about Japan's role in the 19th century throughout the early 20th century. And keep in mind that to this day, Japan is not allowed to have a military.
Yes,
And the reason for that is because they spent like 100 years imperializing all of the countries that they had ocean access to. So, like, the things that they did throughout the Far East.
so that did not start happening until under Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. That's when they started their incursions into into the Asian mainland. This is after, and they did it with guns and military technology that we sold them.
So you're so from what you're saying is that there weren't incursions and there weren't in there.
The measures that the imperialistic tendencies of Japan at that point had just spread to the islands around the big island of Honshu, and at that time they were not doing that. They were not expanding into more territory. They had been stable for the better part of a century at that time, and had also uh, been very isolationist for several decades leading up to this point.
I will need to do a deep dive into validating this.
Yeah, because like the big like imperialist natures of Japan, that stuff started happening in the 1890s. So we're talking 40 years prior to that.
Okay.
Like
I,
in
it,
in
it
large part, they didn't have many firearms until we showed up.
well, yeah, I'm not saying that it was done with firearms, but I
No, 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 no. But
was under the
like
impression that
they
during
had had imperialist tendencies before, for sure, for sure.
yes,
But you also have to take into account that on the world history scale, they had been a punching bag for China for centuries. And I am not talking about the heinous shit that they did during World War II. That's
yeah,
inexcusable. I'm talking about the fact that they fought back against China when China tried to take them over. And then for a while they would literally trade shots by recapturing like 3 or 4 islands from each other.
right,
Like the piddly stuff. I am not talking about their actions in World War II.
right.
We'll get to that at a later date for sure. Anyways, so it was the forced globalization, like essentially economically invading a sovereign country is what we did. Like they literally showed up with trade ships with military escorts saying you're going to trade with us because we said so. It was literally just an exploitation of Japan at that
Okay,
time. At that time. And also he continued to support an enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act.
yeah,
So for me, D tier. Actually,
okay.
I don't know. I don't know. The Fugitive Slave Act was already a thing, and at that point, he was to some degree following the policies of predecessors. So we do have to kind of look at it with a bit of a historical lens.
What's the year of his presidency?
1850 to 1853. I know.
That discussion was already in the public eye at this point.
True, true. You're right. It was D tier. Now the question is, was he better or worse than Taft?
Mm,
Tell you what, I'll put him next to Taft, and we'll say that these two are a wash, just like these two are a wash.
okay.
Because they're pretty neck and neck there, I think. All right,
We've got so many subpar presidents.
dude. I was expecting us to have more C tiers by now, but like as I go through and reread this research that I've done, like man, we have had some lousy leaders.
We don't do democracy doesn't work well for America, does
Don't say that.
it?
You're gonna bring out the Bernie Bros. Anyways, next up is Gerald Ford. Um, okay, so I'm gonna say before I read this, I'm gonna say I think his positives and negatives basically wash, and he's a C. Let's dive in. I'm gonna say that now. So he was an outspoken supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment and women's rights.
Okay.
Now, granted, during his presidency, he he didn't seem to take a stance on abortion. So The actions he took seemed to be pro-choice. It didn't quite match the things he was saying, and so it was a little weird. But he essentially ducked it all by saying he preferred to defer legislation governing abortion to the states.
I mean, that's not really a duck, though.
It it's a duck because Roe v. Wade was already a Supreme Court decision by then, because that happened in '73 and he was president from '74 to '77.
But Roe v. Wade is decided more upon medical privacy.
Okay, you're right. And so like I still labeled it as a positive. Like I think I think it's a negative that he didn't take a definitive stance one way or the other. He was wishy washy in that regard. But overall, he was a big proponent of women's rights and equal rights for all. That
Yeah.
that's an overwhelming positive. That is certainly not something that was characteristic of a lot of his predecessors.
And
Even
instead of wishy washy, I personally interpret that more as delegating to the states.
okay, I'll grant you that one. He While he didn't offer a full pardon to draft dodgers during Vietnam, he did offer a conditional pardon in that you can come back to the United States, you will not be charged, you just agree to do some sort of civil service job for a year or two.
Hmm.
So, while I don't agree with the conditionality of it, he at least made steps in the right direction. And then the negatives, he pardoned Richard Nixon.
I mean, but what did Richard Nixon get? Like, what was he pardoned of? You know?
Watergate.
Yeah, but I mean, like, what is that? Like, in
Illegally,
terms of the crimes
let's
that someone
see.
can do.
So compromising the integrity of an election by wiretapping your opponent to try and find dirt on them, on their strategy to act against them, and then state that because he was president, it wasn't illegal. Essentially, crying that even though he did commit a crime and was complicit in the commission of a crime because he directed these things to happen, claiming that it's suddenly not a crime because he was president.
I mean, there's
That is the
literally
most
like
heinous
this is
instance, like
one.
attempt at claiming executive privilege. I'm sorry, complete BS.
I mean, really, all he had to do was accuse the opponent of like corroborating with Russia, and then like it would have been no different than like what's gone on recently. So,
Either way,
I mean, yeah, okay. So I think the other part about like saying, "Oh, because I'm a president, it's not a crime." That's abuse of power.
yeah. So,
But
and the fact that Gerald Ford, his vice president, pardoned him the day he took office, that speaks to some corrupt crap going on behind the scenes.
I don't. I don't see that the pardoning is the problem here
He shouldn't have been he
because,
shouldn't have been pardoned. Like Nixon should have been held legally culpable for his actions, and he never
but
was.
but he resigned instead of getting impeached.
No, he was impeached. He just resigned to avoid conviction.
Yes, okay, that's he was impeached.
But the
He
thing
resigned
is,
in order to
but the
avoid
thing is, it
conviction.
was still a criminal act. He could still be tried for committing a crime after leaving office.
But would that have been better or worse for the country if he was convicted?
It would have been better because then that shows that a leader was held accountable for committing a crime and for
You
committing a
sure it
crime
wouldn't have just
and for
ended
commit
in
and for
three impeachments?
we don't know. I'm sorry. An executive should be held accountable for crimes they commit. He committed
Yeah.
a crime. There was demonstrable evidence of this. There was a clear chain of corruption going on, and he was not held accountable for it.
No, I mean I agree with
I
I agree
agree that
that
he
someone.
I agree that he should have been convicted of that crime and held legally accountable for it. And yeah,
Yeah.
anyways, we're not talking about Nixon right now. We're talking about Ford.
Right.
Ford pardoning Nixon prevented justice from occurring.
I disagree with that.
You can. That's okay.
Yeah.
And there was poor handling of the burgeoning economic crisis in the mid '70s with that whole whip inflation now or the win PR gimmick. That was just kitschy and just bad. Now, overall, I'm not going to rate him as a D. He did not do some of the really heinous crap that some of these guys did. I think he's a C at best.
If you factor in poor motor skills, he might
No,
fall
no,
to a D.
we're not even talking about him being a klutz. That's not fair. That's not fair.
All right.
If we can't make jokes about cognitive decline, we can't make jokes about klutziness.
Can't make jokes about what? Oh, cognitive decline. Who says we can't?
I am because
Okay.
the comment section. Anyways, next up is Ulysses S. Grant. Let's look at the positives. Yellowstone National Park. That's pretty awesome.
I mean, Yellowstone is awesome, but a lot of people have some legitimate concerns about the national park system.
Yes, yeah. Now that has to do with the way the national park system is managed today. Then that was a good thing. Under, you know, under Roosevelt, that was a good thing. Environmental protections, essentially. Anyways, conservation efforts, I'm all for. But uh, not eco-terrorism, but conservation. I'll
Yeah.
make that clear. The Treaty of Washington in 1871. That was a net positive. Um, he was a big supporter of women's suffrage, calling for equal rights to all citizens. He created the Justice Department purely to combat the KKK.
Yeah.
He brought all former Confederate states back into the Union peacefully. He managed to gradually reduce the national debt through measures contained within the Public Credit Act of 1869. And he secured a legitimate free trade treaty with the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1875. This is before the Sanford Dole thing.
Mm-hmm.
He opened true free trade with a sovereign nation that was off our coast, that was traditionally isolationist. He
So
successfully
what you're
negotiated
saying
that.
is that if we would have done that with Japan, we might have had them as a 51st state.
I don't know about that. That's a lot of ocean between us and them. Anyways, negatives. During his second term, he basically abandoned Reconstruction.
Yeah.
This allowed armed insurrectionist groups like the White League and the Red Shirts to violently and also fraudulently overturn Republican governance in southern states. That's pretty bad.
Yeah.
I don't think that negates all the good stuff, though. I don't. And then you have the Gold Corner conspiracy of 1869, where he panicked and sold a whole bunch of gold because the price dipped a little bit. Now, granted, there was a good outcome of it in the collapse of Gould's Gold Room, which was basically a crony market designed to artificially inflate the price of precious metals. Um, whether or not it was a lasting problem, I don't think it was, because this happened in May of 1869. The economic recovery was back on track by January of the next year, 1870. So I don't see it. I don't see it as a lasting problem. Is it a problem for his presidency in the immediacy of it? Yes, I agree. It was a scandal. Um, but it was not one that had any lasting impact on the country as a
Yeah.
whole. And so for that, I honestly, with all the good stuff on there, I kind of put Grant as a B, like a better B than Coolidge.
Yeah. It's looking like it.
I mean, do you have anything on Grant that you think I missed or anything like that? Or any?
Not about him as a president.
Okay, we're not even discussing the fact that he was a drunk. Like that was before and after his presidency. We're not dealing with that. We're not dealing with personal flaws. We're dealing with how they behave. We're dealing with presidential actions here. Because let's face it, his alcoholism was encouraged by Abe Lincoln. No, seriously, there are actual like primary sources where where someone is complaining, like one of his ineffective generals is complaining about Grant's drinking, and then Lincoln replies with, "But he's winning, right?"
Yeah.
And they reply with yes. And then what he does is he sends a message along with a case of whiskey and says, "Here, give this to him." Basically saying, "You really ought to drink more."
It, that's one way to interpret that message.
Uh, I'm joking. I am being flippant as I'll get out here with it. It's like, but it was anyways. So Grant,
Yeah.
we're done with. Next up, that looks like Warren G. Harding. Republican served as president from 1921 to 1923, so a single term president. But he did, if I remember right, I think he was assassinated. Harding, no, I can't remember if Harding was assassinated or if he just died in office. I think he just died in office. Anyways, but he was around long enough to do some things. He called for reductions in defense spending post World War One to prevent the institution of essentially the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
So that's a positive. He openly supported anti-lynching legislation, and
Hmm.
he openly opposed segregationism.
Yeah.
That's a big
Which
thing.
that's a
That's a
pretty
big
progressive
thing.
move at that time.
In the 20s, yes, that's a very progressive move.
Yeah.
um, a fairly non-interventionist president. He did not get involved on the world stage. Well, when I say non-interventionist, I'm talking about the political act of interventionism in armed military intervention in foreign affairs.
Yeah.
Not necessarily like talking to foreign leaders saying, "Hey, maybe you want to do things a little bit this way. We kind of had this problem before. Let's try to help you out." No, I'm talking about like military interventionism.
Yeah.
He was very interventionist on that part. He's the one that started the federal highway system, the Federal Highway Act of 1921, because automobiles were becoming a big thing by the 20s. And then he also commuted the sentence of Eugene Debs in 1921. Eugene Debs we'll talk more about when we get to my least favorite president. Spoiler alerts if you know who that is.
Oh, oh, we are aware.
You are aware. I don't know if the. I hope the viewers are, because that would mean they're like historically literate and politically literate about the actions of presidents in this country, and that would make me
Yeah.
really, really happy. Anyways, negatives. He signed the Presentum Act of 1921 that restricted immigration due to public suspicion of immigrants rather than any demonstrable evidence. It was an arbitrary um, restriction.
I'm not sure I even understand followed that sentence. You could arrest someone because you think they're an immigrant?
No. He basically stopped immigration and restricted immigration for no reason.
Oh, okay.
He signed the Ford-Niebecumber Tariff Act of 1922, not for any other reason than the fact that it gave him more control over the rates personally. So he was very much about expanding the powers of the president. I'm not a fan of that. And then he opposed and denied a reasonable bonus to World War One veterans. This is actually what led to the bonus army conflict.
Yeah.
I kind of put him as a C. Like nothing really bad, nothing really good.
Yeah. Well, you did list some very good stuff in there, right?
True. Yes, anti-lynching legislation, opposed segregationism, the Federal Highway Act, commuted the sentence of Eugene Debs. All
And
those were,
then,
and the reductions in defense spending. Like all of those were good things.
but then the negatives that you had, although they're not like really a punch in the gut, there are things that are pretty big problems with the Constitution.
Yes, and that's why because they are relatively large constitutional issues, that's where I say it kind of gets into the category of we need to bring him down to a C,
Yeah,
personally.
that makes sense.
Okay. So let's see. Okay. All right. So for right now, I'm going to transition us back to the main screen here. Everybody, this has been episode 1 of the presidential tier list. We are closing in on 2 hours right now. So if you're watching this, you'll be able to jump from one to the next. There won't be a wardrobe change or anything. I'm just stopping recording to break this up into 2 videos. We're a good chunk of the way through presidents. We're almost at the halfway mark. I think this is a good place to stop for a few minutes. And so we will see y'all back in the next episode. Thanks for tuning into the Political Reformation. Again,